So as previously mentioned, functionalism is not the only theory that we look at, and Durkheim is not the only founder that we look at. Today we'll be having a look at Karl Marx, who is a founder of the theory that bears his name, which is Marxism. Now, Marxism is a political and economic theory that essentially looks at society through the lens of class conflict. And we'll be having a look today at Marxism and investigating what Marx said and applying his ideas to our understanding of sociology. As with Durkheim, it's important to remember that although Karl Marx is the founder of Marxism, there have been many writers that have come after him. Obviously, the dates that we've got on the screen here, 1818 to 1883, show you that Marx was writing in a very specific time and context, and as such, that needs to be taken into account when you are evaluating what he is saying. It's important to understand the historical context in which the writers are writing. That isn't to say that there aren't neo-Marxists or more modern updates to Marxism, but from Marx's specific writings, you need to be aware that they are grounded in the Industrial Revolution, essentially. With that in mind, let's have a look at some key terms. So, Marxism, as previously mentioned, is a political and economic theory first espoused by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Later, they developed their ideas, and some of their followers used the basis of Marxism to form communism. It's important to draw a distinction between Marxism and communism. Not every Marxist is a communist, and also not every communist is a Soviet communist. So it's very important that we draw a distinction between the cultural understanding of Marxism and the sociological concept of Marxism. Now, two key terms which is absolutely essential that you understand in order to understand the writings of Marx are the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Now, Marx saw society as split into these two classes. He saw the bourgeoisie as the middle class, or the landowners, factory owners, who he also referred to as a ruling class. These were the people who had positions of power in society, lots of money and lots of power. And he saw these as oppressing the proletariat, who were the working class people who worked in the factories, who worked in the mines. Now, Marx saw society through the lens of class conflict, and he saw almost everything as being constructed to perpetuate this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So let's have a look at, I would say, one of the most famous quotes from Karl Marx, and actually a quote that, if you understand, gives you a pretty good microcosm of the entirety of Marxist thought, really. Obviously, it does become a little bit more complex than this, but the very basis of it is, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Now, what Marx means by this is he is suggesting that the working class, the proletariat, should rise up and seize power and overthrow their bourgeoisie rulers, because from his perspective, they're being oppressed by the bourgeoisie, and they currently have nothing to lose except the chains that keep them bonded to capitalism. Now, these aren't real chains per se, but Marx would refer to them as mind-forged manacles, the chains that shackle us to capitalism, because from Marx's perspective, and most Marxists, or all Marxists' perspectives, capitalism is an inherently negative system. Capitalism is, by its very nature, exploitative. And what this quote here is referencing is that very idea. The idea that workers are being oppressed by the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and they should throw off the chains of their oppression, rise up and seize power. Essentially, it's incredibly important that we understand that Marxists see society through the lens of class conflict. So a bit about Marx himself. Marx was highly influential in the founding of sociology, and obviously the founder of the theory that bears his name, Marxism. Marx, in general, thought that if a place or a society works together, runs on wage labour, then there would always be class struggle. So one of the basic tenets of Marxism, or beliefs in Marxism, is the idea that all employment, essentially, is exploitative under capitalism, by nature of the fact that in order to make a profit, an owner needs to pay his employee or her employee less than they earn. for that owner in order to continue making a profit, which means that anybody who is working through wage labour, so work being paid for their labour, is under capitalism not being paid their worth, not being paid their value. So Marxists would see this idea as inherently exploitative. Okay? And they would also see that this isn't a bug of the system, it's a designed feature of the system of capitalism. Marxists view capitalism as a structural process that has been created specifically to reinforce the power of the ruling class and to oppress the proletariat, the working class. Marx thought that this class struggle would always persist until the workers took power. And Marx saw this as happening only through revolution. Neo-Marxists and modern Marxists potentially have shifted away from the idea of revolution. Some have, but there is a large revolutionary stint to Marxism. And Marx believed that no one should have power over another and that everyone should be equal. Now, as previously alluded to, Marxism was the basis of communism, but it's very important to understand that there is a clear distinction between the implementation of communism in some of the most oppressive regimes throughout history and the sociological study of Marxist theory. Marxism and communism are linked intrinsically, but the evils that were perpetuated under the guise of communist rule in the latter half of the 20th century is not reflected, in Marxist sociological theory. So another quote we can look at here is from Karl Marx again, which goes, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class." This is where we start separating Marxist theory specifically from economics. Marx refers to this idea of ruling ideology or ruling class ideology. And for Marxists, a very important part of the way we discuss society is the way that it is structured in such a way as to reinforce capitalism. So, for example, Marxists believe in this idea of ruling class ideology, the idea that the norms and values in society are set by the ruling class and set to favour the ruling class. This is distinct from functionalism, who view the reason that norms and values exist is because they're positive and they perform a positive function, and that we've all agreed and have these shared norms and values. And this is what makes Marxism an incredibly useful tool for evaluating functionalism. Functionalism is a consensus theory that views the world through the lens of value consensus, whereas Marxism is a conflict theory which views the world through the lens of class conflict. They are both macro theories, so they both look at overarching narratives and meta-narratives and structures in society, but they come to very, very different conclusions as to how this looks and why this has happened. So Marx lived during the Industrial Revolution, which is important to bear in mind. So a lot of his writing is about the proletariat, is reflected in that. The workers that he was talking about are mine workers and factory workers and labourers. Obviously, in modern Britain, that's not necessarily what every worker is, so it's important to bear that in mind. But it is important to remember that society, even today, is influenced by class. Class is an incredibly important part of society in the way that we are separated in society. And all sociologists talk about class, and you need to have a good understanding of what the term social class actually means in order to be able to have discussions about how it impacts people in society. So in short, class is the combination of a person's economic capital and their cultural capital. So economic capital is how much money someone has access to, and cultural capital is broadly about the values, knowledge, and skills that a person has. So Marxists see class as one of the most important factors in deciding success in society, because they view society as being systemically structured by the ruling class to oppress the working class. So very briefly, I think it will be worth our while looking at a 4-mark question. It's important that we understand how to answer these questions and what to expect when we see them in the exam. So we've got an example of one here. So to describe how social inequality can be linked to wealth and status. So essentially for this, you're going to want to make a point, explain that point, make a point, and explain that point. I've given you some sentence starters here, and we'll have a go through an answer that I would write shortly. Things you want to be thinking about are social inequality, which means how the unfairness and differences in society, wealth, which is money, economic capital, and status, which is a personal group's place within society. So how much power they can exert, essentially. Now, wealth and status are obviously linked within a capitalist system. So this is quite a nice question, actually. So let's see how I have answered this. So, first point I've made is that social inequality can be linked to wealth because those who have access to economic capital can use this to gain status in society. I'll explain that by saying that Marx saw this as a product of capitalism and thought the bourgeoisie were using their status to keep their power. Secondary point, status in society can mean that the bourgeoisie are able to use the proletariat and get rich by exploiting their labour. And then a final explanation. This pattern ensures that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, entrenching social inequality along class lines, with class being the combination of a person's economic and cultural capital, which is wealth and status. So obviously this is written from my perspective. I'm not necessarily expecting you to write it in exactly the same way as this, but using the point, explain, structure for a 4-mark question is definitely what you should be doing. So hopefully this gives you a bit of an idea of how one might answer this question. I would encourage you to have a go at this question yourself, and obviously you can use my example as a guide, but as I say, I would encourage you to do some exam practice, because essentially exam practice is the thing that will ensure that you can access the higher grades. So hopefully that's been a brief introduction to Marx and some of the concepts within Marxism for you. Next time we will have a look at Marxism in some specific contexts. But as usual, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the comment section below, or if I am your teacher, just come and see me.